Brian Zahnd, good to have you. We have been anticipating you to be with us, and for you to be here is incredible. I've been a big fan of yours. I recently read When Everything is on Fire and was deeply appreciative
Thank you.
of that book. We share a common interest. I think actually on your Instagram years ago, you were talking about the brothers Karamazov, and I couldn't even get the name right. I don't think I still get it right. Karamazov.
It's the penultimate syllable that's emphasized in Russian. Not that I really know what I'm talking about,
Sure.
but what I just said is true.
Yeah.
And it's Karamazov.
Karamazov. Okay. It just seemed fascinating to me.
Yeah.
So I was a little bit intimidated by it because when I went to look it up, it was, I think, 900 pages.
It's a Russian novel, brother. It's going to be long.
So what I did was I said, okay, I feel like this is going to be something I really throw myself into. So before I get to that, I learned that it might be a good idea to start with Notes from Underground and then work my way up. And so I did all that and was profoundly impacted by Dostoevsky's writings, but most particularly the Brothers Karamazov. Maybe tell me where it began for you.
Yeah, I will. Let me comment though. You did it right.
Okay.
I tell people, if you're going to read all of Dostoevsky's major masterpieces, which are 4, Brothers Karamazov, Crime and Punishment, Demons, The Idiot, if you're really going to do that, not just think you might, but if you're going to, start with Notes from Underground first, because the seeds of all of those are in that one. It's a novella. It's shorter. It's not, in one sense, strong on plot. There's precious little plot to it, but the ideas that receive further development in all of those other 4 masterpieces are there in Notes from Underground. I first read The Brothers Karamazov a little over 20 years ago. I've read it now 11 times. And strangely enough, I don't know if anybody will remember, but you remember when newspapers would just arrive on your driveway? Somebody would
100 years
drive
ago.
by and just throw it there. And on Sundays, it would come with a magazine insert called Parade Magazine. And in it, on this one occasion, there was an interview with Laura Bush, the First Lady. And she was, by training and career, a librarian. And they asked her what her all-time favorite book was. And she said, The Brothers Karamazov. And I wasn't one that was necessarily going to be profoundly influenced by something because it was Laura Bush. But I just thought, I've heard of this book. I know this book somehow is important. I've never read it. I shall read it. And I did, and it just opened a new world to me. I quickly read a whole lot of other books by Dostoevsky, and then began to read copious biographies and analysis of Dostoevsky, so I could fill a couple of shelves with either the Dostoevsky written books or the books about Dostoevsky. So it's been sort of a good obsession for me over the last 20 years.
Yeah, it almost becomes like a hobby.
Right.
Where you want to learn more about the book because they're so complex and they're so deep. And then what all went into the book and how he came up with something like that. Because I think that's the underlying question. How does somebody write something that is that much of a masterpiece?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, I'm a writer, right? I mean... I say that, with a chuckle in my voice because, we're talking Dostoevsky and I say, and I'm a writer too, But what I mean by that is I know just enough about writing to be completely baffled at how someone could write a novel so complex, so intricate, and yet so then filled with theological insights and political insights that... I mean, I know just enough about writing to be very impressed.
Yes.
That someone could pull this off.
And it almost, even as a writer, I'd imagine, kind of makes you feel like this is the person you're comparing yourself to as you write. And it's
so it was Ernest Hemingway who said, I wanted to be the greatest writer that ever lived. And then I read Dostoevsky. And he abandoned that. He said, well, that position's already filled.
I mean, it's tough when you think about what he's actually done. I've tried to get many students to read anything by Dostoevsky. And usually I'll start them with Crime and Punishment.
Crime and Punishment is more accessible.
It is. But they struggle they ask themselves in the beginning, what am I holding out for? And I always tell them, like, just hang in there, let it pick up a little bit. I mean, in Crime and Punishment, the axe murder scene isn't too far into the book.
Right.
But there's a beauty when it all comes together. What would you say to a student who picks up a Dostoevsky for the first time and wants to put it down right away?
Yeah, well, sometimes it's maybe I'm part of the problem because I've extolled it so highly and then maybe quoted a few passages or at least alluded to a few passages, and they're in a rush to find the, quote, good part or the theological part. And I have to remind people, first and foremost, this is a story. So slow down and just let the story unfold and trust the storyteller. In this case, it's Fyodor Dostoyevsky. And just trust him that if you will be patient and not try to rush, how come I really don't quite understand what's happening yet? You're at the feet of a master. He has already been vetted. Mm-hmm. Trust Dostoevsky to tell a story that is worth hearing if you'll just be patient and let it unfold and come to you as he sees best.
Yeah, I heard somebody say one time, it seems like, I think it was Dostoevsky starts slow and you feel like he's wasting pages, but what he's really doing is steadying your neck so he can look you in the eye, punch you in the face. But, I love that. Which I felt like, yeah, that's about right. Because Demons, I think I counted the amount of pages it takes to get to the place where it really takes off. It's about 464 pages in. And you realize why he's been taking his careful time to get to the place where it all starts coming together. And you really are glad that you stuck with it, and you feel like you're at the feet.
Demons is I feel like that's a very important book. And what stands out about, well, I would say especially Brothers Karamazov and Demons, those two especially, that, they are published in 18... I'll get my dates wrong here. 1880, Brothers K, Demons, 15 years earlier, something like that. They're so timely. They speak to me now. And then Demons on how prophetic it was.
Yeah.
What happened was, people might be interested slightly in this. Dostoevsky, early in his career, was sort of I don't want to use my words carefully. He was a progressive, critical of virtually all things conservative, and was part of a subversive writers group, ends up arrested, condemned to death, but that was commuted, and he ended up 4 years hard labor in a Siberian gulag, and then several years more of exile in Siberia. And it was during that time that his Christian faith is recovered, and he then becomes somewhat critical of the burgeoning Marxist movement within Russia that he had been a part of. And it's astounding how Dostoevsky foresees where this is headed. So, he's writing in the 1860s, 70s, up to about 80, and Demons is prophetic of what's going to happen with the Bolshevik Revolution and how, with the Civil War that followed over the next 5-6 years, 11 million people are murdered in Russia. And Dostoevsky set out to write a pamphlet warning about what was coming. Mm-hmm. And then he thought, wait a minute, I'm not a pamphleteer, I'm a novelist. And so instead of writing a pamphlet warning about the nascent nihilism within Marxism that he saw them moving towards. Instead, he would write a novel that could be a little bit more subversive but more lasting and could issue his warning that way.
Yeah, I mean, you've mentioned that he was prophetic. Did reading Dostoevsky, as a Pentecostal charismatic, your background,
Right.
did that at all shape how you saw prophetic ministry or what the role of a prophet, quote unquote, was? The way he was able to connect the dots to see what's taking place, what's coming down the pike?
I would say insofar as the prophetic doesn't have to be just simply a prose utterance of rebuke or encouragement, but can come in the form of a story told.
Yeah, the way that he shapes his characters is almost it's timeless in the sense that it's speaking to something about human nature where there's deep theological insights, deep sociological insights, theological insights, and philosophical insights that just continue to carry forward. How do you think that a theological student who's working through their thoughts, trying to see the world, develop a worldview, could benefit from that foresight that Dostoevsky had and what he placed into his characters?
Well, I think, first of all, there's value in recognizing that there are those outside of narrow theological disciplines that actually have a lot to contribute to theological discourse. Dostoevsky's a novelist. He's not a theologian. He's not even a political scientist, and yet he speaks so persuasively and with such deep psychological insight into those worlds. And again, I'm talking as a pastor theologian. What I can tell you is that the Brothers Karamazov is rather unique in its prevalence in serious academic theological works. It just shows up over and over and over. Now, now and then some other novel, some other work of fiction, now and then may be cited in theological works, but you can count on Brothers Karamazov. Just, it becomes common. And so I think anybody that's interested in studying theology at a serious level, at some point, just is going to have to read that book. Just to find out why so many other theologians cite this work.
Yeah, I mean, every theological student that is dealing with the Odyssey and the problem of suffering, at some point is going to come across the Grand Inquisitor. Maybe speak into what that is, and as best as you can for the person that hasn't heard about because I read it and had read it again, and I'm still reading it, to extract pieces from it that I missed the first go around.
The Brothers Karamazov is referring to three brothers. Dmitri, 28, recently retired military officer. He's sensual, he's impulsive, he brash and loud, good-hearted but reckless. Then there's the 24-year-old Ivan, the atheist university student. He's the intellect. He's an intellectual. And then 20-year-old Alyosha is a novice monk. And they are the three sons of Fyodor Pavlovich, the worst father ever.
Yeah. Understatement.
That's an understatement. He's this horrible lecher that is, he only loves debauchery and money. That's it. And at a crucial point in the novel, and this isn't giving away anything, fairly early on, Fyodor Pavlovich, the father, is murdered. And then it becomes a patricidal murder mystery. Who done it? Who killed the old man? And I won't say any more than that. But at one point, Ivan, the intellectual atheist, and Alyosha are having a meal together in a tavern. They don't really know each other, even though their brothers are only 4 years apart. They haven't spent much of their life together. They don't really know each other. And Ivan, in a really kind of a malicious way, deliberately said, well, he has mixed motives. He is trying to undermine, perhaps even destroy, his brother's Christian faith. And yet he also says, or maybe I want you to save me. And so he's going to launch a very vicious attack against Christianity. But maybe lurking somewhere deep down is a hope that maybe not only Alyosha can survive my assault upon Christian faith, but can somehow rescue me. Now, he does this by initially, and remember, this is Dostoevsky that writes this. I mean, Dostoevsky is a committed, believing Christian, and he is going to present what, to my mind, remains to this day quite possibly the most forceful argument against Christianity we have faced.
It's tough.
And so, if his whole objective, or at least part of his objective in the Brothers Karamazov, is to offer a credible defense of the Christian faith in the modern era, he is not going to go up against a straw man. He's going to make it as hard for himself as he possibly can. And Ivan makes his case. He says, I'm actually not rejecting God. He says, I don't know. Does God exist? Does God not? I don't know. Did God create man or did man create God? It doesn't really matter. To me, he says, what matters is whether we created God or, I acknowledge that God exists, whether it's a human creation or eternal. It's God's world I reject. And so because I reject God's world, I'm going to return my ticket. He's saying, no, thank you, God. I don't want to be a part of your kingdom. You may redeem the world. The whole world may eventually all say everything is healed and shout Hosanna, but I'm not going to do it. I'll return my ticket. Here you go.
Too much of a price to pay.
Too much of the price. And what he cites is the suffering of children. And he gives several heart-wrenching accounts of the suffering of innocent children. And he kind of challenges Alyosha. Would you build your paradise upon the suffering of even one innocent child? And Alyosha says no. And he says, but there is one that was innocent and suffered, and it's built upon him. And Ivan says, I was wondering when you would get to him, because that's what you people usually run right off to Jesus, and you've sat here and waited till now. Mm-hmm. And he says, well, I've composed a poem, and it's not a poem, but he calls it a poem. And he says, I've composed a poem. And what he calls a poem is what is known as the Grand Inquisitor. And it's this fantasy that Jesus has returned to whatever it would be, 16th century Seville during the Spanish Inquisition. Not in glory in the Perusia, the second coming, but just popping back in to see how things are going. And he returns as he was when he roamed the hills of Galilee. And strangely enough, though, people immediately recognize him. There he is. It's him. It's him. And he heals, I think, maybe a blind man. He raises a little girl from the dead, and people are thrilled. And now appears the 90-year-old Archbishop Grand Inquisitor, Cardinal Grand Inquisitor, who orders him to be arrested. And they do, because they may be excited that Jesus is here, but they fear the Cardinal Grand Inquisitor. Because, just yesterday he burned 100 heretics at the stake. And he throws Jesus in this dungeon, and then and threatens that he's going to burn him to death in the morning. But in the middle of the night, the Grand Inquisitor comes to visit Jesus. Now, in this whole thing, Jesus never speaks. The only time he speaks is early on when he raises the little girl from the dead. He says, Talitha Kumai, which is, right out of the scripture, the Aramaic, yep. Little girl arise. Jesus never speaks. And it's written so well because you think maybe Jesus will speak, and then the Grand Inquisitor says, don't say a word. You don't have a right to add anything that's already been said. And the Grand Inquisitor begins to explain to Jesus that they, the religious hierarchy of essentially atheists who maintain the facade of religion because it makes people happy before they slip off into the oblivion of nothingness. Mm-hmm. That they have corrected his mistake. And he walks Jesus through the wilderness temptation, saying that when the dread spirit came to you, he was actually not tempting you, but giving you wise counsel, but you didn't have enough sense to see it all. And you should have turned the stones to bread and just given people bread and satisfied their physical needs. That's what you should have done. You should have supplied them with enough proof and miracle and you should have thrown yourself from the temple, from the pinnacle of the temple. You certainly should have taken up the sword and taken for yourself the imperial purple, united the world and ruled the world by force. But you didn't do it. But where you failed, we're going to succeed, and we're going to correct your mistake. And he goes on. This is lengthy. It goes on for page and page and page and page and page. And finally, he ends it by saying, and in the morning, I will burn you at the stake. Dixie. That's Latin for I have spoken. But it doesn't end there. And the Grand Inquisitor actually is hoping that Jesus will retort, defend himself. He says even if he says something harsh, even if he, rebukes him or whatever, he wants to, Jesus doesn't say anything. Jesus just looks at him, stands up, walks over to the Grand Inquisitor, and gives him a kiss on his 90-year-old bloodless lips. Ivan, in telling this to his brother, says, the kiss to this day burns in his heart. Nevertheless, the old man clings to his idea. And then the Grand Inquisitor turns to Jesus, opens the door of the cell and says, go. And don't ever come back. Go. And releases him into the night. Which is a strange ending. And I'm going to, before I finish the story, I'm going to insert something here. I suspect that what is happening here is that Jesus is actually coming to life in the story. That Ivan, who's actually creating this story to disrupt or dismantle Christian faith, I think loses control of Jesus. I think maybe even Dostoevsky does. I think maybe what happens, that this moment of the kiss is maybe, Dostoevsky is surprised. I think Ivan is certainly surprised. And so he gets done, and Alyosha recognizes it. He says, you set out to defame Jesus, but you've actually praised him. I mean, you really weren't able to complete the task of attacking Jesus. Yes, you've attacked the church, you've attacked certain aspects of the Jesuits and Catholicism, but only the very worst parts anyway. Mm-hmm. I think you've actually praised Jesus. And Ivan says, well, nevertheless, I cling to my assertion that without God all things are permitted, and I am returning my ticket. Now, I'm rejecting God. Will you reject me? Alyosha gets up, walks across the room, and kisses his brother on the lips.
It's masterful.
And Ivan screams, plagiarism, plagiarism. You took that from my poem. But it's so beautiful.
It's like an artist putting that story together, like in a way that has deep irony. So then he proceeds forward. The story proceeds forward. You
want me to tell the whole story?
Well, I mean, I guess
we're going to be here 5 hours.
We're going to be here 5 hours. Yeah. But do you feel that I've read in some commentaries on Dostoevsky that the rest of the story of the Brothers Karamazov is how Ivan unfolds after that? And, that is unfinished business as it moves forward into Ivan's life.
So you have Dostoevsky mounting an attack against Christianity. Now he's got to try to recover. And he does so fairly directly in the next 2 books. The novel consists of 12 books. And Pro and Contra, that's the one that has the Grand Inquisitor we've been talking about. That's book 5. Book 6 is the Russian monk, the Elder Zosima, who's somewhat based upon the historical figure Saint Tikhon of Zadokh. He does it somewhat through that. And then the next book, Alyosha, and Alyosha's involvement with Grushenka and being a source of forgiveness for her. But then you get to I think it's book 10 is the Ivan Karamazov,
where he meets the devil,
where the devil comes to him, and you see all through the book you'll hear people, as it were, cursing, say, "Oh, the devil take it, devil take you, go to the devil." It's over 100 times in the book.
It's a lot.
It's so frequent that it finally caught my attention. And I think this is not just a way of mild cursing, but I think Dostoevsky's saying, be careful about intentionally turning away from God and toward the darkness, saying you're going to return your ticket, because all you have left is the devil. And of course, Ivan, as an atheist, doesn't believe in God. He doesn't believe in the devil either. And yet, the devil comes to him. Now, it could be a dream. Mm-hmm. It's a little bit hard to tell. I mean, you could interpret it that way or not. And at one point, Ivan's convinced it's not a dream. Mm-hmm. And so I would say the refutation, which is not a refutation, Dostoevsky doesn't supply a point-for-point refutation of Ivan's argument. What he does is provide an alternative way of looking at the world, even amidst suffering, even the suffering of innocence, through the life and teachings of Elder Zosima, and then carried on in practice through his young disciple Alyosha as he sent him to the world. But then he also, Dostoevsky, gives us a warning of what returning your ticket and turning toward the nihilistic philosophy that without God all things are permitted, where that might lead. And that's in that, I think it's book 10, the book on Ivan Karamazov and When the Devil Comes to Him, which is also a brilliant passage.
Yeah, there's so many elements of the story that really provide you time and space to have to sit there and think about, if you go this route, what kind of effect it's going to ultimately have on you. I was reading, I can't remember which secondary literature on Dostoevsky, and the author pointed out how Dostoevsky in the novel is using ordinary people in ordinary places. Things are taking place in the most ordinary spaces, dark alleys,
right,
drab bars, prisons, to illustrate that this could be at any point any one of us and any one of our cities, and we ultimately are the characters that we come in contact with, and in meeting those characters, we in a way meet ourselves.
This is part of Dostoevsky summoning his prowess as an artist, that he gives us so many characters who are all, to a person, believable. There's sort of the ditzy Madame Haklakova, who is a humorous character, but entirely believable. There's the despicable seminarian atheist careerist Rakitin, who, though I find horribly annoying, I also know people like this.
Yeah.
And just on and on it goes. So on one level, you could say, okay, there's metaphor going on. So I would say Dmitri, the eldest, represents the sensual life. When I say sensual, I don't necessarily mean sinful, although it includes that. But it's just a life built around the fleshly senses. Sensual life. Certainly, Ivan is the intellectual life, and Alyosha the spiritual life. And not to give away too much, but Smerdyakov, who may in fact be another brother, is the demonic.
So it covers all the ranges.
Yeah, I think so.
Of human personality. Yeah.
But none of them, my point is, none of them are created cheaply. Mm-hmm. So they're just sort of a two-dimensional, cheap stand-in for a metaphor. No, all three, and then if you include Smerdyakov, 4, are entirely believable.
Yeah, there's an air of, and somehow when you read any Dostoevsky novel, there's an air of humor in all of it as well.
And that's something that I had to learn more. I mean, I saw it to a certain extent initially, but then the more I read, the more I see it. And I would also give a little recommendation that it's worth, you can, I'm not a huge audiobook guy, but I do listen to some. I definitely recommend at some point you listen to the audiobook. I don't remember who the narrator is, but it's using the Macduff translation. Mm-hmm. And first of all, this narrator is tremendous, very skilled, using different voices for the different characters, but it does bring out the humor. You see, my goodness, there is a lot of humor in this book. So it isn't, you say a Russian novel, Dostoevsky, probing the dark psyche of, there's that, but there's just a lot that's very funny.
How did it add to your Christian faith, reading Dostoevsky? What layers did it bring to your
well, Dostoevsky, primarily the Brothers Karamazov, but to a certain extent, demons really influenced my political theology. I wrote a book called Beauty Will Save the World, which is taken directly from The Idiot.
Yeah.
So it had, in one sense, it has directly informed certain aspects of how I think theologically, but also it helped me understand that theological work can be attended to in other ways than just academic prose. Now, that may remain the backbone of how we go about this, but there is a place for novelistic theological work or a place for theopoetics. And so it just broadened my concept of how we might intelligently and creatively talk about God revealed in Christ.
Yeah, it got me thinking a lot about, you hear a lot about quote-unquote apologetics in a way to counter an atheist argument.
Yeah.
But what Dostoevsky's doing, in my opinion, has been more convincing than any apologist I've ever heard.
You have no idea how many times that has been what I have recommended to at least an atheist or agnostic seeker. That is, they presently occupy a position of atheism or agnosticism, but they're open to further argument. And I'll say, well, don't listen to me. Don't read me. Go read the Brothers Karamazov.
Now, what is it about that Dostoevsky and what he does?
Well, first of all, he has a track record. There was a revival, a Christian spiritual revival in Russia. I forgot when. I want to say around the 1960s, and I don't mean Russia. I mean the Soviet Union. After communism, and it began among Russian intellectuals. And I've been to Russia a lot. I know these people. I've met some of these professors, and they said, well, they took away our Bibles, but they couldn't take away Dostoevsky. And people were able to find Christian faith just by reading Dostoevsky.
Yeah,
and so what I'm saying, it has a track record. It actually has worked in the past.
Yeah, it's worked, and I think to myself how just reading the psychological unraveling of an Ivan or seeing that where the debauchery of Dmitri leads is enough to make me stop for a second and understand that we may have rationalistic systems that are philosophical, but humanness is, in a sense, irrational. And, that's something that philosophy doesn't necessarily account for, or apologetics accounts for, in the sense of what are we without God and what do we become when God is the missing piece in our life? And is that really the kind of world that we want? It's startling.
Yeah. And even Ivan, who is the cold logician of the brothers, in the end, in his turning away from God, he's the one that quite nearly loses his mind. Mm-hmm. And there are sober warnings within the book.
Or the beauty of Father Zosima.
Yeah.
Listening to him, his piece, his last words in the book bring tears to my eyes. I believe it was in his last words where he talked about being careful around a child, to have a demeanor because you don't know if your outbursts are going to plant a seed in that child.
Yeah.
Things of that nature that are so profound.
You brought up something that we hadn't touched on. Children play a tremendous role throughout really all of Dostoevsky's work, but in particular Brothers Karamazov, not only in Ivan using the suffering of children as his argument against God, but then you see the alternative in Alyosha taking a group of young boys who have, for a particular reason, have begun to focus their animosity upon a single other child. There's a whole story there. And how Alyosha is able to heal that rift and bring them together. It's quite clear that Alyosha is carrying on Zosima's work and task, but he's a Christ figure. And of course, the number of the boys we're talking about is 12. You know, it's Jesus and the 12 disciples, and Kolya is sort of like, you know, the Apostle Peter. He's the leader of the bunch, and I think that's marvelous. And I'll you know, the hero of the book is Alyosha. Well, shortly before beginning the writing of the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky's 2-year, 9-month-old son, Alyosha, died of epilepsy. And epilepsy, you know, figures into the book. And Dostoevsky himself was epileptic. And he had so he was writing this in the process of grieving the loss of a child. I think it says something about Dostoevsky that, well, we get this, that he names his hero, Alyosha, after his departed son, but the most despicable character in the book, the father, Fyodor, well, that's his name. He gives his name to the most despicable character. So Dostoevsky, I can assure you this, he never saw himself as saintly or anything like that. He always saw himself as a sinner, and if he was going to be saved, it was going to be by the grace of God.
Yeah, I'm thinking about, as you're mentioning all these characters, maybe I can ask this question kind of as pick your brain a little bit. When you think of all the Dostoevsky novels, which character, if one, stands out to you, seems to be the most darkest to his whole corpus?
Darkest?
Because I know what I think. But I think Stavrogin in Demons, there's something about him, his mask-like appearance.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
His mask-like appearance, his dark hair.
Yes. How many times, this phrase is in there several times, his face was like a mask. That phrase is repeated throughout that novel.
The complexity of his character.
He's scary because he doesn't show a lot of emotion.
Indifference.
Yeah, indifference. So you see other characters who are passionate in their anger is really not as dark as that deep indifference.
And that piece right there, because I know that he plays a central role, not just in that book, but in all of Dostoevsky, but the way, you know, there's the mention of the man God a lot in Dostoevsky's novel, and how he's being looked to. I mean, you have Kirilov over here who's thinking about creating the man God, and then you're wondering while you're reading, is Stavrogin the man God that he's actually looking to? And then how everybody's looking to Stavrogin as this sort of central figure that's going to bring political revolution.
Right.
But at the same time, him and his, you know, self-exaltation, he's destroying everybody around him. And then he ends up destroying himself.
And Stavrogin also destroys a child in a chapter that was so...
censored.
It was so disturbing, it was censored. And depending on what version you get now, sometimes it's an appendices at the end. I would prefer that it be put back where Dostoevsky intended it.
Yeah, Tikhon's. And
right.
It's frightening to see that. And then he's doing all of these experiments to see if he can feel. He pulls an old man's nose, passionately kisses another man's wife in front of everybody, and he doesn't care.
Right.
The entire time. And if that doesn't speak to a life without transcendence, a life without the divine, a life without God in the center of it, and give you room to pause, I'm not sure that anything will.
Right.
And it's deeply frightening.
I mean, the book is named Demons.
And you know what I learned actually is, and I haven't checked it, but I read it recently, the last word of the entire novel was insanity.
I don't remember. I'm going to check. You know, and English translations, about half of them call it the possessed. Half of them call it demons. And my good friend Dmitry Polyakov, Russian, St. Petersburg, lives a couple blocks from Dostoevsky's apartments. It's now a museum. And who is a translator himself. I mean, I've asked him, demons? Possessed? And he just goes, it's kind of both.
I want to ask you about one more character, if you don't mind.
Okay.
The Underground Man.
Yeah.
I've had to write.
I think something's wrong with my liver. Not that I know anything about livers. That's how the book more or less opens.
Yeah, we're all piano keys, you know.
Yeah.
And I've had to write a little bit about on each, but trying to get him down almost seems like trying to nail Jello to the wall, because he's contradictory in everything that he does.
Yeah.
He despises people, but yet at the same time, he is nice to people. But then he resents himself for being nice to people. Then he tries to control the people. Then he hates himself for it. I mean, it's back and forth.
The whole passage where there's some guy that always, that one time bumped shoulders with him in the crowded St. Petersburg Street on I even know the name of the street. Nevsky Prospect. And and then he's determined that he's going to meet him and not step out of the way. But every time he can't help it, he steps out of the way of this guy
and buys a new outfit.
And then he goes and buys a whole new suit that he can't afford, and gets all dressed up, and still can't. And then finally one day they just sort of casually bump shoulders, and he's like, "I did it." Oh, poor guy.
Or then when he tells the story about how he invites himself to his friend's party, and nobody likes him, and it's almost like you're wondering, am I seeing innocence here or am I seeing spite? And you can't figure it out. You know,
I don't know. You're right. I can't figure it out.
Yeah, and then of course he tries to control the maiden.
Yeah,
but you're left thinking, you know, what's this guy's deal? I remember reading it and expecting to be horrified, but the entire time I'm laughing because it's so humorous how petty he really is and how pathetic the entire.
And we call him the Underground Man because, you know, the book is entitled Notes from Underground. It's written in first person, and we never know his name.
Never know his name.
And which I think, Dostoevsky apparently wants us to at least have a hint that he stands in for a whole lot of people.
Yeah, it could be anyone again.
I mean, I've read Notes from Underground 3 or 4 times. And I mean, this may sound cheap, but I've just thought, man, that guy just needs somebody to invite him to a good church.
Yeah.
I mean, I say that, and some people might misunderstand it, but I actually really think, I mean, where he could encounter some version, not perfected, but just some attempt at some unconditional love.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you may be awkward, you may be socially awkward, you may not fit, but you know what? Come and be a part of us. Be with us.
Yeah. And that's the whole aspect of the Dostoevsky's characters being real characters, that you feel like you know these people. They're part of your life.
I know people that are relatively healthy and happy in our church, that without our church or some church like ours, they would be the Underground Man.
Yeah. And there's parts of it as I was reading it where I thought, man, I could see myself becoming this way.
Yeah.
If I didn't have meaning.
I think I've certainly read it and thought, I've seen my mind at times go in that direction. Mm-hmm. I don't want to do that because I see how bad that can go.
Yeah. You're working on a new book. Is it okay to share a little bit about it?
I've just It's now the publisher's turn to work on it for a while. This is how book writing works. You write a book, you're done. You send in the manuscript. You don't hear anything for 2 months, and they send it back, and we begin the editing process. But that's where we are. It's called Paths of Unseen Existences. That will be the title. The subtitle might end up being The Pilgrimage of the Soul Toward Our True Home. That's my suggestion.
Yeah.
But we'll see what the publisher thinks.
How long does it take you to write a book?
A year.
A year?
I mean, I can write a book in...
Like the manuscript.
I can write a book in 2 months, if that's all I did. Mm-hmm. If I was just a full-time writer, I could write a book in 2 months, but I'm not a full-time writer.
We have writing students, so how many words a day is
1,600. When I write. I don't write in snippets. I have either it's a writing day or it's not.
And you're going for, is there a set amount of words that you're going for in that writing day?
1,600 is my average. If I only write 1,000, that's fine. I don't like writing under 1,000, and I don't ever really get to 2,000 because I don't think I can write 2,000 good words in one day. You can for an essay or something like that, but not for a book. And it begins with me, a writing day begins with I reread the previous day's work, whether it was yesterday or a month ago. I go back over it and try to improve it. And then I advance the book, let's say 14, 15, 1600 words, that's several hours. And then I sit with my wife, who reads it back to me out loud. And that's serving two purposes. One, she will make suggestions along the way. She's always my first editor. But also I'm hearing it, because how a book sounds to me matters, because I do want a certain amount of poetic sound. Not, I don't mean it as rhyming or anything, but I mean I want it to have a bit of
rhythm in it,
poetic rhythm, meter, and so I'm hearing it in another voice, and that's a day. Let's say I probably don't start on it till like 10 a.m. because I'm doing other stuff. It's 10 to 4.
Yeah,
6 hours.
Yeah,
for that's enough.
That's good. Brian, we have to jump, man.
I enjoyed this.
Yeah, it was great.
I mean, I just love talking about Dostoevsky.
Yeah, same. We share the same bond there.
Yeah.
So thank you for being with us, Brian, and we're always happy to have you at SCU.
Thank you.